A new poll shows trust in the United States has fallen to a record low here in Australia. The poll by the foreign policy think tank the Lowy Institute also finds Australians are warming to China. But despite that, support for the US-Australia alliance remains relatively high. Let's bring in our foreign affairs reporter, Stephen Dziedzic. Hi there, Stephen. It sounds like Australians don't like the Trump administration or the president. What sort of impact is it having on attitudes towards the US?
Yeah, that's right. What we're seeing at the moment, Lorna, is essentially trust for the United States, according to this latest poll by the Lowy Institute, really cratering. And that means that it's falling to levels that have never before been seen in this poll, which has now been in the field for some 20 years or 20 years plus. So, if you look at the latest numbers, for example, only 31% say they have some trust or even any level of trust in the United States to act responsibly in the world. Now, that's only 3 points higher than China. 28% of those who were polled in this particular survey say they have a level of confidence in China to act responsibly. So the two great powers are basically seen as equally untrustworthy by most people in this poll. That is a stark difference to the picture just 4 or so years ago, when there was a massive 53% gap between the two. So at that point, you saw more than 60% of Australians saying they basically had confidence in the United States to do the right thing or to act responsibly in the world, and only 12% of Australians said that they had faith in China. So it was absolutely chalk and cheese. But with this real cratering in support for the Trump administration, that gap has basically disappeared. One thing that is interesting, though, Lorna, despite the fact that you've got this terrible result, particularly for Donald Trump and for the US, is that Australians are still retaining a pretty high level of confidence in the US alliance. So in this latest poll, for example, you've got 73% of Australians saying they still believe, despite their distrust of the United States, that the US alliance is important to Australia's security. Now, that is a fall from last year. We've seen basically a 10-point drop over 2 years, but it's still higher than the number of Australians who said that they were, who believed that in the US alliance back during the Iraq War. Back then it was something like 63%. So it's a pretty complicated picture, but look, the broad brush is clear. Trump is not popular, and that is having an impact on the way that people see the United States. It's just not yet having a big impact on the way we look at the US alliance.
OK, what do Australians, how do they look at China?
Well, at first glance, it's still not great news for China. Despite the fact that Trump's numbers have fallen so terribly, Australians still have a greater faith narrowly in the US over China. But if you dig into the data, it looks much better for China. Now, not only is trust in China rising, albeit off a slow base, the way Australians view China is shifting as well. Now, just about 4 or 5 years ago, vastly more Australians saw China as a security threat more than an economic partner. But if you look at this latest poll, that's flipped. So you've now got something like 60% of Australians saying they see China primarily as an economic partner, whereas the number of Australians who say now they see it primarily as a security threat has dropped really sharply. Now, that might be because the government has stabilised the relationship with China. Those really terrible numbers came at the nadir of the relationship when China was hitting Australia with punitive sanctions, and there was a lot of anxiety about what that might mean. But of course, we haven't seen a massive shift in China's behaviour, and we've still got evidence of its massive military build-up, the circumnavigation of Australia by the People's Liberation Army Navy. So you can only conclude, as the researchers have done here, that some of that distrust towards the US and dislike of Trump must be bumping up the numbers for China and must be making Australians, or giving Australians a reason to take another look at China and perhaps consider it in a more favourable light.
Interesting. Did the survey look at which countries, which leaders indeed are most popular with Australians?
Yeah, this is always a fascinating one, Lorna, and typically if you look at the feelings thermometer, which country does Australia or Australians regard most warmly, the answer is always the same: it's New Zealand. And it was New Zealand again this year, right up the top of the feelings thermometer. But then you look at the individual leaders and it's a slightly different story, that the top ranking leader, the leader, global leader if you like, that Australians have the most confidence in is actually the Prime Minister of Canada, which is a fascinating fascinating development. So Prime Minister Carney's speech in Davos and then here in the Australian Parliament has clearly cut through. He's 1 point ahead Christopher Luxon, New Zealand's Prime Minister, who's the second rank there, still polling very well, and then Prime Minister Takaichi from Japan, who comes off next best. But when you ask Australians, who do they trust in the world, it's not, Donald Trump or Xi Jinping. Only about 20% of Australians regard them favourably. It's broadly speaking liberal democracies, including liberal democracies in our region, which is why you see countries like Japan, like New Zealand, and interesting, including European countries like Germany and France ranking very highly indeed.
Stephen Dziedzic, thank you.